Okay, we're looking at our reflex arc again, and we got to the part where when we touch something, we really don't have to think about pulling our hand back when we touch something, because the information basically goes from a sensory neuron that senses the painful heat touch, in this case, relays that information back. Here's again, our dorsal root with our dorsal root ganglion with our sensory nerve cell body. It releases neurotransmitters to this interneuron. The interneuron then relays the message to both excitatory motor neurons and inhibitory motor neurons. And when we excite the excitatory motor neuron and we contract the muscle, then we automatically release the hot handle in this case. But we were also aware that we did that. We didn't necessarily think about it before we did it, but we were aware that we got burned. We were aware that we released that because we also send information from this area up the spinal cord and eventually, goes to that parietal area, and we sense whatever part of the body that was stimulated, that was monitoring the nerve receptors in this area. So, now we could have a different scenario where we actually, let's say instead of this being a hot pan, let's say that we're reaching for something and all of a sudden there's a snake getting ready to strike at us. We may pull our hand back in that case, but that's because the information actually, maybe the sensory information was actually coming from our eyes to our brain. Our brain recognized that there was a snake there, so it sent information down, again causing us to stimulate the motor neurons that cause us to pull our hand back. In that case, the information started from the sensory organs such as the eye, or maybe we heard a rattle on a rattlesnake, eye and ear maybe, but it started in the brain area and actually came down and caused us to actually pull this back. That wouldn't necessarily be a reflex, that'd be more of a learned behavior because we maybe learned snakes could hurt us in some way. Whereas this is actually a reflex. It's not necessarily a learned behavior. It is actually something that happens automatically because of this arc running from our sensory areas in our skin to our spinal cord to our muscles. But at the same time, as we were saying, we still were aware of what happened, so we still sent information up to the brain to be interpreted. So when you go to the doctor and he actually hits your knee area, your patella tendon with a little hammer and your knee kicks, he's actually testing to make sure this arc is working correctly. Again, a couple of examples. These are fairly detailed, but just to make the points that now here, notice we have visceral motor coming out of the ventral area, somatic motor coming out of the ventral area, eventually going to a spinal nerve, which has mixed sensory neurons coming back into it or motor neurons leaving it and going to different areas. Notice here we have our dorsal root ganglion again. Here are nerve cell bodies from our sensory neurons. We're receiving information back that are either going to be somatic sensory from like skin sensations, or visceral sensory from some sort of organ or organ sensation. But the big take home from this is that, the dorsal side is going to be sensory, the ventral side is going to be motor. We are going to send it out to either skeletal muscles or smooth muscles. And again, skeletal muscle will be somatic motor, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle basically would be the more of the visceral motor areas. And of course, smooth muscle could be even things running in our blood vessels. So blood vessels can be embedded. Actually, our skeletal muscles have all kinds of blood vessels running to and from them, but the walls of the blood vessels are actually smooth muscle, whereas the skeletal muscles themselves, obviously, are skeletal muscle. Okay, so we're going to get information kind of arising from different parts of the spinal cord. Of course, something has to stimulate them to send the information, but we will have all kinds of different connections, most of them originating in the brain. All right, now here is actually what a nerve itself, the 31 spinal nerves or 12 cranial nerves, they're actually organs. And organs, of course, are made up of tissues. So what we see here, we have an outer connective tissue covering of this organ called an epineurium. When you look at the muscle, the skeletal muscle information, you're going to see that you actually have an outer connective tissue layer of your skeletal muscles called epimysium. Okay, then within the epineurium that's covering the whole organ, we've got these bundles here, and the bundles are called fascicles. So look at this bundle called a fascicle. That's also a bundle. That's a bundle, a fascicle, a fascicle, a fascicle, and same thing, we would see the same thing even in skeletal muscle. Now, the fascicle is surrounded by another type of connective tissue called perineurium. So all these things that are holding that fascicle together, this area here, this connective tissue that's connecting or holding it together, again, is called perineurium. Now, inside the perineurium, we have actually axons running through the inside. So all these little areas here, that's an axon, that's an axon, that's an axon, there's an axon, axon, axon. And of course, axons are where we're going to send the information, send the action potential or nerve impulse that we generate so we can release neurotransmitters to something else. So a nerve is actually full of axons. It's not necessarily full of dendrites and nerve cell bodies, because remember, that's going to be back in the spinal cord, and that's going to be in the gray matter area. But the nerve is where the axons are either leaving or going back. If they're coming back, they're usually going to the sensory areas, the sensory neurons. If they're leaving from the ventral side, then they're going to be motor neurons, the axons of the motor neurons. So we have this outer layer of connective tissue called epineurium. We have this middle layer that surrounds each of the fascicles called perineurium. And then we actually have connective tissue that actually surrounds and insulates and also isolates each of the axons from each other. So this third connective tissue that is surrounding each axon is called endoneurium. And of course, what we see here is we see what we call myelin, and it's made up of support cells called Schwann cells. And what they do, they wrap around, so they insulate that so that we only have little areas that's not insulated called nodes of Ranvier. So it actually speeds up our signal in a process called saltatory conduction. We'll discuss that in a different topic. Okay, finally, we come to the end of this section on the spinal cord, but what we want to look at is, notice over here, we talked about the fact that we had 31 spinal nerves, and we said that we had actually 8 cervical nerves and 7 cervical vertebrae. Notice we actually have 12 thoracic nerves, we have 5 lumbar nerves, and 5 sacral nerves, and then that 1 coccygeal nerve. But what we want to look at here is, of course, the nerves actually form areas that we call plexus. Notice we have something called a cervical plexus, so it is primarily going to be where our cervical nerves are. And notice these nerves that are interweaving with each other. They're not just individuals like this. Notice there's no interweaving in this area right through here. Therefore, we don't have something called a thoracic plexus. But we have something called a brachial plexus, which involves a couple of the thoracic nerves. And we have some of the thoracic nerves, especially T1 and T2, that are kind of interweaving with some of these cervical nerves. Okay, so this interweaving area is the plexus, and notice that they go out and they form certain nerves. Now, you don't necessarily have to know every nerve here. I do want to point out a couple, though. Especially I want to point out this one right here, the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve, which is originating off of the cervical plexus, actually is the nerve that goes to your diaphragm. That's why you have to be super careful if somebody has a neck injury, because your diaphragm is what actually enables you to breathe by moving up and down and changing the atmospheric pressure on either side of it, causing air to go inside or outside of the lungs. So if you were to damage this nerve, you could possibly keep the diaphragm from working and keep the person from being able to breathe. So anytime there's a neck injury, you've got to consider, is anything messing with the phrenic nerve? So you got to be very careful moving somebody, because you don't want anything to damage that phrenic nerve. Now, another nerve I want to point out in all these nerves here is this nerve here called the sciatic nerve, which is the largest nerve in the body. Notice that it's coming basically out of the sacral plexus area, and we have these different areas that weave into it. And notice it runs across the hip down the back of the leg. Now, if you've ever had sciatica or sciatic nerve problems, you definitely have felt and know where this nerve is, because it is very painful. And one reason why I like to point it out, since some of you will be heading into the medical field where you may have to give shots, one thing you need to realize is you never want to stick a needle in the largest nerve in the body. So there are certain, when you get in your clinical classes and stuff, they will tell you certain landmarks to feel where to stick a needle in, but I want you to understand, at least at this point, that a lot of what you're trying to do is actually keep from, really hurting somebody by sticking a needle in the sciatic nerve, because it's usually the larger needles and the thicker medicine that go into hip area as opposed to maybe the arm. Okay, so we have these different plexus. Brachial, remember brachial means upper arm, so notice brachial plexus, most of those nerves are leading out here to the upper arm. We have lumbar plexus, notice it actually does include T12, but notice again, as I said earlier, we don't have a thoracic plexus. We do have a sacral, we have this interweaving here, so we have cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, but go back and view the previous videos, and that will at least give you a beginning point to start understanding part of the nervous system dealing with the spinal cord.